Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're talking about one of the most unlikely comebacks in recent geopolitical history, the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Two countries that have spent the better part of a decade in a bitter, sometimes bloody rivalry have decided to play nice, or at least nice-ish. From diplomatic showdowns to proxy conflicts and even China's role as the unlikely peacemaker, we'll explore how and why this détente happened. How did it develop since last autumn and what it means for the future of the Middle East? Let's get to it then. Here is our latest report.
Once deadly foes, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been maintaining renewed, although tentative, relations ever since China brokered a rapprochement between the two in March 2023. The foregone rivals have named ambassadors, set up embassies, and exchanged senior-level visits. But more than a year into the reconciliation, progress has gone little beyond that and facilitating Hajj for Iranian pilgrims. A little progress is to be seen if Riyadh expects Tehran to ditch its Middle Eastern allies without any security guarantees. Nor can it be achieved if Iran believes Saudi Arabia and its Gulf Arab allies will end their security partnership with the US. Tehran has felt that Saudis were dragging their feet on their promise to boost economic relations while still keeping Iran at arm's length in regional security discussions. In the mind of the Saudis, Iran has not done much to phase out its non-state proxies in the Middle East through which it projects regional influence. This applies particularly to Yemen, where Tehran's backing for the Houthis is a long-standing concern. Both countries have been on opposing sides of the barricade in several regional wars, including the one in Yemen. In the midst of that conflict, when the US launched a maximum pressure campaign of economic coercion against Iran in 2019, Tehran reportedly stood behind attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure later that same year. It will also be difficult to resolve Saudi Arabia and Iran's years-long competition for the hearts and minds of Muslims. The kingdom is a predominantly Sunni Muslim country, the Republic a Shiite majority one. Both offshoots of Islam entertain contrary beliefs as fundamental as whether the religion's prophet Muhammad ordained his son-in-law and his offspring to stand at the helm of the Muslim Ummah or not. Now, with the normalization in place, tangible cooperation is required to solidify the jittery structure.
And now we're zooming in on Tehran and Riyadh to find out more about this story. In November last year, then Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi touched down in Saudi Arabia, marking the first visit by an Iranian leader in almost 11 years. Now, if you're wondering why that matters, let's rewind a bit, shall we? You see, this isn't just a reunion of two old frenemies who had a falling out over, well, pretty much everything. This is as big as Oasis getting back together. Picture 2016, a year when everything seemed to go wrong. Saudi Arabia executes a prominent Shiite cleric, Nimr al-Nimr, and in response, Iran's citizens storm the Saudi embassy in Tehran. Cue diplomatic ties getting severed in a heartbeat. And for nearly a decade, these two were at each other's throats. Saudi Arabia and Iran were locked in proxy wars across the region, most notably in Yemen, which has suffered through one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The situation was so bad that even the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain downgraded or cut off ties with Iran. And if things weren't complicated enough, Qatar, Iran's more chill neighbor, got caught in a blockade initiated by the remaining Gulf Cooperation Council members. So, peace in the Middle East, yeah, it seemed about as likely as a unicorn riding a flying carpet. But then something truly unexpected happened. It was China, a country not usually associated with Middle Eastern diplomacy, swooping in like a hawk. With months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, China managed to broker a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You know it's serious when both sides reopen their embassies and exchange ambassadors. This was diplomacy on steroids. Suddenly everyone was shaking hands, smiling for the cameras and whispering, maybe, just maybe, things are about to change. But why now? Why would two sworn enemies decide to kiss and make up? Well, as it turns out, there were plenty of reasons. Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 program, has been trying to diversify its economy, reduce its dependency on oil, and emerge as a regional power that can do more than just pump out barrels of crude. To do that, it needs stability. On the flip side, Iran was facing a serious economic crunch. Sanctions had isolated Tehran, and with a domestic population growing increasingly restless, the leadership knew it needed to focus on internal stability. Plus, Iran saw an opportunity. By repairing ties with Saudi Arabia, they could weaken US influence in the region, especially as America's presence has been feeling a little ghost-like lately. And speaking of the US, Washington was not too thrilled about all this. After all, the US has been the dominant foreign power in the Middle East for decades, but China's diplomatic play raised eyebrows. Is this the beginning of Beijing stepping into America's shoes as the region's power broker? Well, not so fast. While China did orchestrate this rapprochement, it is unlikely to be ready to replace the US as the region's security provider. China's aims are more about pushing countries to cooperate economically and diplomatically rather than deploying troops and drones, for now at least. So where does that leave us? Well, Saudi Arabia and Iran aren't about to become best friends anytime soon. There is still plenty of distrust, ideological differences, and proxy wars to sort out. Whether this peace holds or whether we're back to square one in a few years remains to be seen. And now here to shed more light on this story is Marcin Krzyżanowski, Middle East expert from the Jagiellonian University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
It's nice to be here.
So it is often said that where there is will, there is a way. Do you think that it is for the lack of will that the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is actually not really progressing quite as quickly as some might have hoped?
This is a very complicated issue, and not only Riyadh and Tehran, but also regional countries and foreign powers as Russia and the United States, of course, are involved. First and major obstacle to deepen cooperation or make the relation even warm between those two countries even warmer are United States sanctions. Saudi Arabia is a strong ally of United States, and Saudi Arabia relies on United States guarantees of security. And it is important member of U.S. tailored architecture of the security in the region. Tehran, on the opposite, is the main troublemaker from the U.S. point of view, main enemy in the Middle East. So without having this in consideration in mind, it's clear that deepen and warmer relations between those two countries are impossible to achieve without major political shift in the region.
Well, do you think that you would actually need a blessing from the United States? I mean, it is actually no surprise that the US was not involved in this rapprochement. Instead, it was China. What do you think is China's interest here? And are they actually seeking the remodeling of the architecture in which the US might not actually have that much to say?
For China, the main reason to be involved in the Middle Eastern affairs is, of course, oil. China at the moment is dependent on Middle Eastern oil. His main buyer of Iranian oil and very important client for Saudi Arabia. And tensions between those two countries put the maritime oil routes in danger. Also, each time for example, Chinese diplomat came to pay a visit to Tehran, Riyadh got a little bit angry, and of course that worked other way too. With easing the tensions between Riyadh and Tehran, now Chinese diplomacy has much easier work than in the past, although tension, the problems between Saudi Arabia and Iran remained in place. Fortunately for the region, both sides decided to talk it out instead of getting deeper into a conflict.
So what you're saying is, for China, any sort of rivalry between these two countries is bad for business. But it is not that the rivalry is going to disappear, even if they actually re-establish diplomatic relations as they have, even if they continue on perhaps slightly less contentious issues. I mean, there is still, for example, the matter of the nuclear program. Do you think that if Iran continues along its path, if there is no new revived JCPOA in place, then is Saudi Arabia going to just watch idly as Iran achieves a nuclear weapon capacity, or would they be compelled to react to this, leading perhaps to a nuclear arms race in the region?
Definitely, Saudi Arabia will not look idle on that issue. The statement of many Saudi politicians and diplomats made the case clear. If Iran obtained nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia very soon will do the same. So
it's really interesting when you say that they are going to do that very soon. It normally takes time. Do you think they actually have a source where to obtain it from, or perhaps are conducting some research without really telling everyone about it?
Most probably, the Saudis' plan is to buy. Of course, it's not simple transaction, but it's to buy nuclear weapon to start nuclear program with Pakistani help.
So effectively, that would mean the non-proliferation efforts are going out of the window. But before it happens, do you think there is a chance that there is something else at play there? The two countries have started to mend their relations. Embassies were reopened, but now it is actually stalling. So could there be anything else? Perhaps Saudi Arabia counting on Iran to stop being the troublemaker, which you said it was. Is it even realistic to expect that Iran is going to abandon its allies, such as Hezbollah or the Houthis, and suddenly become a model neighbor, only engaging in peaceful and predictable relations? I mean, can it even, is it even on the cards?
Definitely not. This time my answer will be very, very, very simple. No, absolutely not. There is no possibility that Iran will change its behavior at the moment without major change in the United States policy, which is very unlikely. So Iran and Saudi Arabia decided to freeze their conflict, decided to talk it out. But the problems, the differences remain in place. For at the moment, the highest level of cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Iran is mutual non-interference in the internal affairs issue. But the deeper cooperation, for example, in the field of trade and investment, is at the moment impossible.
And would it have any sort of meaning when we consider the change at the helm of the Iranian government? I mean, we actually have a new leader, Masoud Pezeshkian. Do you think that his leadership could actually bring a new momentum to this? Or is it really something that doesn't really matter, given that ultimately it is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei who has to approve everything?
The second option, definitely. The foreign policy lies in the hand of a supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Although the president is not is not a puppet in his hands. He has its own political strength and prerogatives. Although everything must be accepted by the supreme leader. Masoud Pezeshkian is a very talented politician. and his position in the region can be strengthened. And as a quite skillful yet amateur diplomat, Pezeshkian showed his will to cooperate with regional partners, especially the neighbors of Iran, in whatever fields the cooperation is possible. At the moment on the table is cooperation on the field of science and culture, although the progress is very, very slow.
Speaking of partnerships, but this time in relation to Saudi Arabia, you've mentioned that it remains a staunch ally of the United States and a part of the security architecture. But there have also been recent moves that suggest that Saudi Arabia definitely wants to be more independent. Do you think this is really the case? And if so, could this actually make it easier for these two countries to have better relations if Saudi Arabia were to move away from the security architecture, therefore not being bound to the idea that Iran has to be contained?
For sure, emancipation of Saudi Arabia from United States patronage would help to establish stronger relations. As I said before, United States is the main sanction giver and main enemy of Iran, at least from the point of view of Tehran. But United States security guarantees are crucial for Saudi security and for the monarchy itself, not the state, but the ruling dynasty. So I don't think that that emancipation of Saudis will go so far to reach the case of Iran.
In other words, you may play multipolarity all you want, but you must not forget that one of these poles is still the US, and it's not just going to disappear.
Definitely, that's a very good, very correct sentence.
So there you have it, the situation in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran trying to mend their relationships, but also encountering many, many differences along the way. Marcin Krzyżanowski was our guest today here on Eastern Express, explaining the intricacies of this difficult relationship to us. Thank you very much for joining us and, of course, for sharing your knowledge and insight on the issue.
Thank you for your invitation and always at your service.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. They say speech is silver, but in case of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his British counterpart David Lammy, it's actually hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds. The two officials descended on Kyiv to announce more aid packages as Ukraine urged clearance on the use of Western long-range weapons on Russia's territory.
In Kyiv, Blinken and Lammy announced new aid packages worth $700 million and $782 million, respectively. The package announced by Blinken is designed mostly to bolster Ukraine's energy grid, while Lammy's comes in the form of assistance and loan guarantees. The officials felt that the Russo-Ukrainian war had reached a critical juncture. As Blinken and Lammy arrived from Poland on a train, Russian forces were battling in eastern Donetsk and pushing out Ukrainian forces from Russia's Kursk region. Kyiv has been pleading with its allies for months to greenlight firing Western weapons, including U.S. ATACMS and British Storm Shadows. The range of the British cruise missile would allow Ukraine to reach Russia's capital, Moscow, as well as military facilities near cities such as Tver, Ryazan, and Tambov.
President of Turkey Recep Tayyip Erdogan has endorsed the returning of Crimea to Ukraine, citing international law. The statement comes as a surprise while Turkey is applying for BRICS membership. So why the bold declaration? More on that in this report.
Speaking at the Crimean Platform Summit in Kyiv, an event focused on the deoccupation of Crimea, Erdogan stressed that Turkey's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence remained unwavering. The official said the return of Crimea to Ukraine was a requirement of international law and praised Ukraine's legal measures to protect the rights of Crimean Tatars, the peninsula's indigenous people. Erdogan's statement, although surprising at first, is very much in line with his pan-Turkic policy, a concept according to which Turkey should act as the custodian of all Turkic people. The Turkish president's stance could come across as audacious, given Turkey's efforts at joining BRICS, an organization including China and Russia, with the latter being not the least inclined to relinquish Crimea.
There is no place for plurality of views or opinions in Russia. On Wednesday, the country's military court sentenced a former Russian opposition lawmaker to 10 years in prison. The reason? Find out more in this latest news story.
Russia continues muffling voices that go against the Kremlin's dictate. One of those voices belongs to Ilya Ponomarev, a Russian-Ukrainian politician and a former member of the Russian State Duma, who was sentenced in absentia to a decade behind bars. He was the sole member of the State Duma to vote against Russia's annexation of Crimea in March 2014. Impeached just 2 years later for not performing his duties, Ponomarev went into exile in Ukraine, where he obtained Ukrainian citizenship in 2019. Upon Russia's invasion, Ponomarev joined Ukraine's territorial defense forces and denounced Moscow's incursion.
And now this faraway story to wrap up this Eastern news flash. Let's take a look at Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan dissuading their citizens from traveling into Russian territory.
The Tajik embassy in Moscow issued an advisory on Tuesday telling Tajiks to temporarily refrain from traveling to the Russian Federation unless absolutely necessary. The Kyrgyz Foreign Ministry published a similar note earlier in September. These moves could have a painful impact on Russia's and also Tajikistan's and Kyrgyzstan's economies. Moscow relies heavily on hundreds of thousands of labor migrants from both Central Asian countries. On the other hand, the migrants' relatives back at home are strongly dependent on remittances. But the attitude in Russia toward at least Tajik migrants has grown hostile since the Crocus City Hall terrorism attack, in which Tajik militants killed over 140 individuals attending a concert in Moscow. Responding to the event, Russian lawmakers tightened migration rules, facilitating the expulsion of those found in the country without proper documentation. But even without the new rules, the Russian economy would be suffering an acute labor shortage. During the first 7 months of 2024, almost 93,000 deportation orders were handed out to foreign citizens, the majority of them from Central Asia.
For this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.